Picture this. You wake up wealthy on a Tuesday morning in 1929, check your investments, and by dinner that same day, you're broke. No war declared, no natural disaster, no warning sirens. Just the most catastrophic economic collapse in human history. You're raising fortunes faster than you could say stock ticker. Welcome to October 29th, 1929, the day that didn't just change America. It rewrote the entire playbook of what prosperity could become. But here's the twisted irony. After all the devastation, after all the suffering, after reshaping an entire nation's relationship with money and government, some argue that nothing truly changed at all. Today, we're diving deep into the Great Depression, the decade that proved American optimism wasn't bulletproof, and examining whether the lessons we supposedly learned actually stuck. Now, let me take you back to where this story really begins, not in the crash itself, but in the intoxicating years that made it inevitable. Picture America in 1922. The Great War is finally over, soldiers are home, and the country is drunk on possibility. Factories that once churned out tanks and ammunition have pivoted to manufacturing the stuff of civilian dreams: automobiles, radios, refrigerators that made iceboxes look medieval. The skyline of Manhattan is shooting upward like a time-lapse video. Jazz music is revolutionizing entertainment, and everyone from bankers to barbers genuinely believes they've cracked the code of permanent prosperity. This wasn't just optimism, this was economic evangelism. Leading economists were proclaiming that boom and bust cycles were relics of the past, that American ingenuity had finally conquered the unpredictable nature of markets. Herbert Hoover himself would declare that America was nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. These weren't just campaign slogans, they were articles of faith in an entire generation's worldview. The engine driving this confidence was innovation at a scale never before seen. Henry Ford's moving assembly line had revolutionized manufacturing, cutting the time to build a car from 12 hours to 90 minutes. The Model T, once a luxury item, was now rolling off production lines and into the driveways of ordinary Americans. This wasn't just about cars. It was about a fundamental shift in how things got made. Every industry, from steel to textiles, adopted assembly line principles. Mass production became the norm, and suddenly the American middle class could afford things their parents could never have imagined owning. Cities were transforming into electrical wonderlands. By 1929, 10 million American homes had radios, meaning families could gather around these magical boxes and hear live music, news, and advertisements beaming directly into their living rooms. The consumer culture we recognize today was being born, and Americans were embracing it with the enthusiasm of kids in a candy store. But there was a problem lurking beneath all this prosperity, one that would prove catastrophic. The majority of this spending was happening with borrowed money. Enter the financial innovation that would help destroy everything. Installment buying, or as we know it today, consumer credit. Want a radio? Finance it. A car? Finance it. A washing machine? Put it on the payment plan. Banks, giddy with the possibilities of this new market, were practically throwing loans at anyone who could fog a mirror. The logic seemed bulletproof. Wages were rising. The economy was growing. What could go wrong with letting people buy tomorrow's prosperity with today's optimism? But the real addiction wasn't consumer goods, it was the stock market. Wall Street had become America's casino, except everyone was convinced the house couldn't win. Margin buying allowed ordinary people to purchase $100 worth of stock with just $10 down, borrowing the rest from brokers who were themselves borrowing money to fund these loans. It was leverage stacked on leverage, a house of cards built with borrowed cash, an unshakable faith that stock prices only moved in one direction, up. The stories from this era read like financial fever dreams. Shoeshine boys were giving stock tips to millionaires. Barbers were quitting their shops to day trade utilities. Elevator operators were pooling their tips to buy into hot new companies that existed more in imagination than in any concrete business plan. Between 1924 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average quadrupled in value, and every rise in price validated the collective delusion that this time was different, that America had somehow transcended the basic laws of economics. Meanwhile, the foundation of this prosperity was rotting. Agricultural America, which still represented a massive portion of the economy, was struggling. Farmers who had prospered during wartime found themselves facing plummeting crop prices as European agriculture recovered. They responded by borrowing money to buy more land and better equipment, convinced that scaling up would solve their problems. Instead, it just meant they went broke more efficiently. Income inequality was reaching staggering levels. By 1929, the richest 1% of Americans controlled nearly 40% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 40% controlled just 12%. This wasn't just unfair, it was economically unstable. When the wealthy stopped spending, there weren't enough middle-class consumers to pick up the slack. The engine of consumer demand that had powered the boom was running on fumes, but nobody wanted to acknowledge it because the stock market kept climbing. Companies were getting creative with accounting, setting up holding companies that owned other holding companies in complex webs designed more to confuse investors than to create actual value. Stock prices had completely divorced themselves from any rational assessment of company fundamentals. People were buying shares in businesses they couldn't name, making profits they didn't understand, with money they didn't actually have. A few voices tried to sound warnings. Economist Roger Babson predicted in early 1929 that a crash is coming, but his warnings were drowned out by the champagne-fueled optimism of a nation convinced it had discovered the secret to permanent wealth creation. The party was too loud, the profits too intoxicating, the collective delusion too complete for anyone to hear the approaching thunder. Then came October 24th, 1929, a day that would forever be known as Black Thursday. It started with just a few sellers, nothing unusual for a typical trading day. But something was different this time. As prices began to drop, the margin calls started coming in. Remember all those people who had bought stocks with borrowed money? Their brokers wanted the rest of their cash immediately, but these investors didn't have the rest of their cash. They had spent it or invested it, or simply never had it in the first place. Panic spread like wildfire through the trading floors of Wall Street. The elegant ticker tape machines, symbols of modern financial efficiency, couldn't keep up with the volume of selling. They fell hours behind, meaning nobody actually knew what their stocks were worth until long after they'd been sold. Phones rang incessantly, men in expensive suits screamed at each other across crowded floors, and the carefully maintained veneer of sophisticated investing collapsed into primitive fear. By the end of that Thursday, the market had lost 11% of its value, but that was just the beginning. October 28th brought another 13% decline, and then came October 29th, Black Tuesday, when over 16 million shares were traded and the market lost another 11%. In less than a week, 40% of the stock market's value had simply vanished. $14 billion, worth more than $200 billion in today's money, was gone. The human stories from those days are heartbreaking. Men who had been millionaires on Monday were bankrupt by Friday. Families who had spent the summer making vacation plans were suddenly wondering how they'd pay rent. The newspapers tried to maintain optimism with headlines like, "Market corrects as investors take profits." But underneath these sunny pronouncements were photographs of grown men crying on street corners and families packing their belongings into whatever vehicles they still owned. But here's the crucial point that many people misunderstand. The stock market crash didn't cause the Great Depression. It revealed the Great Depression. The underlying economy had been sick for years, propped up by unsustainable borrowing and speculative investing. When confidence finally cracked, the entire artificial structure came tumbling down. Banks, those pillars of community trust with their marble floors and oak desks, turned out to be built on the same foundation of borrowed money and wishful thinking as everything else. As stock prices collapsed, banks couldn't collect on the loans they'd made to investors, which meant they couldn't pay back their own depositors. Bank runs began almost immediately, crowds of desperate people gathering outside locked doors, demanding money that simply wasn't there anymore. The psychological impact was devastating. Americans had believed their prosperity was permanent, that their financial system was the most sophisticated and stable in the world. Suddenly, they realized that their wealth had been largely imaginary, their security an illusion, their faith in endless growth a dangerous delusion. The optimism that had defined the 1920s curdled into a bitter skepticism that would define the next decade. Before moving forward, if this video made you stop and think, then the conversation doesn't end here. Leave a comment below and tell me what topic you want us to go deeper into next. This channel exists to break down what most people are never told, and your questions shape what comes next. If you want to understand these shifts before they become obvious to everyone else, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. Because what's coming won't be explained on the evening news, but it will be explained here. As 1930 dawned, the initial shock was giving way to grim reality. Unemployment began rising steadily as businesses failed and factories closed. The automobile industry, which had been the symbol of American prosperity, saw production collapse by 75%. Detroit, the Motor City, became a ghost town of shuttered plants and unemployed workers. The assembly lines that had once represented the triumph of American efficiency now stood silent, gathering dust. The banking system continued to collapse in slow motion. Without deposit insurance, when a bank failed, ordinary people lost their life savings. 1,300 banks closed in 1930 alone, and each failure triggered more panic, more runs on healthy institutions, more destruction of the confidence that any financial system requires to function. People who had trusted banks began stuffing cash under mattresses or burying it in their backyards, further reducing the money supply and deepening the economic collapse. By 1931, the crisis had gone global. American banks, desperate to shore up their balance sheets, called in loans they had made to European institutions. This triggered a cascade of failures across the Atlantic, where economies were still fragile from World War I. Germany's economy, which had been slowly recovering from its own devastating inflation, collapsed entirely. Britain was forced off the gold standard. Global trade, the engine of international prosperity, began to seize up as country after country raised tariffs and trade barriers to protect their domestic industries. President Herbert Hoover, a capable engineer and successful businessman, found himself completely out of his depth. He believed that government intervention in the economy was both dangerous and un-American, that private charity and voluntary cooperation would be sufficient to address the crisis. He launched public works projects like the Hoover Dam, but refused to provide direct federal aid to unemployed workers or failing businesses. His name became synonymous with suffering as homeless encampments were dubbed Hoovervilles, and newspapers used for warmth were called Hoover blankets. The statistics from this period are staggering, but they don't capture the human reality. By 1932, unemployment had reached 25%, meaning 1 in every 4 Americans who wanted to work couldn't find a job. But this wasn't evenly distributed. In some industrial cities, unemployment reached 50% or higher. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned as families lost their homes and moved in with relatives or simply disappeared into the growing population of itinerant workers searching for any kind of employment. Bread lines became a common sight in American cities. Long queues of people waiting for a bowl of thin soup and a piece of stale bread. These weren't lazy people or social outcasts. They were the same workers who had been building cars and operating machines and keeping America running just a few years earlier. Teachers, clerks, factory foremen, and skilled craftsmen all found themselves in the same lines, their pride and self-worth slowly eroding along with their savings. The psychological toll was immense. Marriage rates plummeted as young people couldn't afford to start families. Birth rates fell to historic lows as existing families couldn't afford more children. The suicide rates spiked dramatically, and newspapers stopped printing obituaries because they couldn't keep up with demand. Behind every statistic was a human being who had believed in the American dream and found it had been a mirage. Just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, nature itself seemed to turn against America. The Great Plains, stripped bare by decades of intensive farming, began to blow away. The Dust Bowl was both a natural disaster and a man-made catastrophe, the result of farming practices that prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability. Massive dust storms, some reaching heights of over 10,000 feet, swept across the heartland, burying crops, killing livestock, and making the air unbreathable. Families packed everything they owned into broken-down cars and trucks, joining the massive migration westward in search of work that largely didn't exist. These Okies, though they came from many states beyond Oklahoma, became symbols of American displacement and desperation. They arrived in California to find that the Promised Land was already overcrowded with other refugees, that the available work paid starvation wages, that the American dream had become a nationwide nightmare. The political system struggled to respond. Hoover, trapped by his ideological commitment to limited government, continued to insist that recovery was just around the corner while offering little concrete help to suffering Americans. Radical movements began to gain traction as desperate people looked for someone, anyone, who seemed to understand the scope of the crisis and had bold ideas for addressing it. The summer of 1932 brought a particularly shameful episode when thousands of World War I veterans marched on Washington, demanding early payment of bonuses they had been promised for their military service. These men had fought for their country and now found themselves homeless and jobless, camping in makeshift shelters near the Capitol building. When Congress refused their request, President Hoover ordered the Army to clear them out. American soldiers used tear gas and burned the veterans' camps, creating images that shocked the nation and further damaged whatever credibility the government had left. Crime rates soared as desperate people turned to illegal activities to survive. Bank robbers like John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde became folk heroes, not because Americans endorsed crime, but because these outlaws were seen as striking back at the institutions that had betrayed everyone else. The social fabric of the country was fraying as traditional sources of authority, from banks to government to business leaders, had all proven themselves incompetent or corrupt. Yet somehow, through all this suffering, something essential held. Americans didn't give up. They adapted, they migrated, they formed mutual aid societies, they took care of their neighbors when government and business failed them. Families doubled up in overcrowded apartments, shared whatever food they could find, and somehow maintained hope that things would eventually get better. Not because they had evidence that improvement was coming, but because the alternative was despair too complete to contemplate. The 1932 election offered the country a choice between more of the same with Hoover or a dramatic change of direction with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt, a patrician New Yorker who had overcome polio, projected confidence and promised bold action to address the crisis. His famous declaration that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself was not just political rhetoric. It was a recognition that America's problems were as much psychological as economic. that the country needed to rediscover faith in its own capacity for renewal. Roosevelt didn't wait for his official inauguration to begin acting. In the famous first 100 days of his presidency, he launched a bewildering array of programs designed to address different aspects of the crisis. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work planting trees and building parks. The Works Progress Administration employed millions to construct roads, bridges, schools, and post offices. These weren't just jobs programs, they were attempts to rebuild both infrastructure and dignity. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity to one of the most impoverished regions of the country, transforming the lives of millions of rural Americans who had never had electric lights or refrigeration. For the first time, families could gather around radios in the evening, children could do homework after dark, and farmers could use electric equipment to increase productivity. It was a visible symbol that government could improve people's lives in concrete, measurable ways. Roosevelt also tackled the banking crisis head-on. The Emergency Banking Act gave the federal government power to inspect and reorganize banks before allowing them to reopen. The creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation meant that ordinary people would never again lose their savings because of bank failures. The Securities and Exchange Commission was established to prevent the kind of speculative excess that had inflated the stock market bubble. Perhaps most importantly, Roosevelt understood that people needed hope as much as they needed jobs. His regular fireside chats on the radio brought the president into American living rooms, explaining government programs in plain language and projecting confidence that the country would recover. He wasn't promising easy solutions or quick fixes. He was asking Americans to trust that their government was finally taking their problems seriously and working systematically to address them. The New Deal programs were controversial and not always successful, but they represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between Americans and their government. Social Security created a safety net for elderly Americans who could no longer work. Labor laws established minimum wages, maximum hours, and the right to organize unions. These weren't radical socialist programs. They were pragmatic responses to the reality that unregulated capitalism had failed catastrophically. The Federal Arts Project employed writers, photographers, and painters to document American life during the Depression, creating an invaluable historical record while providing work for creative people who might otherwise have starved. One photograph, Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, became an iconic image of the era's suffering and resilience. Hollywood contributed to the recovery effort by producing escapist entertainment that helped people forget their troubles for a few hours and remember that better times might be possible. Cities began to show signs of life again. Restaurants reopened, construction projects resumed, and factories started humming with activity once more. The sounds of jazz music returned to nightclubs and dance halls. Americans were cautiously allowing themselves to hope that the worst was behind them, that the country was finally climbing out of the economic pit it had fallen into. But recovery was slow and incomplete. Unemployment remained stubbornly high throughout the 1930s, never falling below double digits, until World War II created massive demand for both soldiers and factory workers. Many of the structural problems that had contributed to the Depression, particularly income inequality and corporate concentration, were addressed but not eliminated. The American economy was stronger and more stable than it had been in 1929, but it was still fragile. The international situation was deteriorating rapidly. The global economic crisis had contributed to the rise of fascist movements in Germany, Italy, and Japan. These extremist governments were using military aggression and territorial expansion as distractions from domestic economic problems. By the late 1930s, it was becoming clear that the world was drifting toward another global conflict that would make World War I look small by comparison. When World War II finally arrived, it completed the economic recovery that the New Deal had begun. Massive government spending on military equipment, the employment of millions of men as soldiers, and the transformation of American industry to support the war effort finally brought unemployment down to negligible levels. The irony was not lost on observers. It had taken another world war to fully end the economic depression caused partly by the aftermath of the previous World War. Looking back at the Great Depression from our current perspective, the lessons seem obvious. Unregulated financial speculation leads to bubbles that always burst. Extreme income inequality undermines consumer demand and economic stability. When private institutions fail during a crisis, government intervention becomes necessary to prevent complete collapse. International cooperation is essential because economic problems don't respect national boundaries. But here's where the nothing changed part of our story becomes relevant. Despite the obvious lessons of the Depression, many of the same patterns have repeated themselves throughout American history. The savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, the housing bubble that led to the 2008 financial crisis, all followed similar trajectories of speculation, over-leveraging, and eventual collapse. Each time, experts proclaimed that better regulations and oversight would prevent future crises, and each time, those safeguards were gradually weakened or circumvented. The The fundamental tension between capitalism's drive for short-term profits and the long-term stability that societies need has never been resolved. The political coalition that supported New Deal reforms gradually fragmented as prosperity returned and memories of the Depression faded. Successive generations of political leaders, many of whom had no personal memory of the 1930s, dismantled regulations and embraced the same free market ideology that had contributed to the original crisis. Income inequality, which the New Deal had significantly reduced, began rising again in the 1970s and has now returned to levels not seen since 1929. The financial sector, which had been tightly regulated after the Depression, was gradually deregulated starting in the 1980s, leading to the same kinds of speculative excess that had characterized the 1920s. The social safety net that Roosevelt had created was systematically weakened by politicians who argued that government assistance created dependency and stifled economic growth. Perhaps most tellingly, the same faith in endless economic growth and technological progress that had characterized the 1920s reemerged in different forms throughout the following decades. The computer revolution of the 1990s generated the same kind of irrational exuberance that had inflated the stock market bubble of the 1920s. The housing boom of the 2000s was fueled by the same assumption that prices could only go up that had driven speculation in both stocks and real estate during the Roaring Twenties. The Great Depression changed everything about American society: the role of government, the relationship between employers and workers, the expectations that citizens had of their political leaders, the understanding of how markets actually function. But it also changed nothing fundamental about human nature: the tendency toward greed, the susceptibility to mass delusions, the willingness to believe that this time is different, that the basic laws of economics have somehow been transcended. The institutions created in response to the Depression, from Social Security to banking regulation to unemployment insurance, have provided crucial stability and support for millions of Americans over the past 9 decades. They represent genuine progress in creating a more humane and sustainable form of capitalism. But they haven't eliminated the boom and bust cycles that seem inherent in market economies, and they haven't solved the underlying tensions between individual profit maximization and collective welfare. The story of the Great Depression is ultimately a story about the limits of both markets and government, about the difficulty of learning from history, and about the resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. It's a reminder that economic systems are human creations, not natural forces, and that they can be changed when they stop serving human needs. But it's also a warning that change is difficult, that entrenched interests resist reform, and that each generation must learn anew the lessons that previous generations thought they had established permanently. As we face our own economic challenges in the 21st century, from technological disruption to climate change to growing inequality, the Great Depression offers both hope and caution. Hope, because it demonstrates that even the most severe economic crises can be overcome with sufficient political will and social solidarity. Caution, because it shows how easily the lessons of one crisis can be forgotten, how quickly the institutions designed to prevent future disasters can be weakened, and how the same human impulses that created one catastrophe can create others. The year 1929 changed everything about America, reshaping government, society, and the economy in ways that persist to this day. But it changed nothing about the fundamental challenge of creating economic systems that serve human flourishing rather than just private profit. The challenge remains as urgent today as it was when Franklin Roosevelt first took the oath of office, promising to wage war against economic despair and social injustice. Whether we'll prove any better at meeting that challenge than previous generations remains an open question, one that each era must answer for itself. This is just one piece of the bigger picture. Subscribe if you want to understand the full context and how to better protect yourself in uncertain times. And the video on screen takes this story one step further.